I think there's a very credible argument to be made that Alexander Volkanovski is the single greatest mixed martial artist on the planet. The pound for pound question was front and center in my mind, as both Volkanovski and Petr Yan prepared to compete at UFC 273. With no disrespect intended towards Kamaru Usman, I did feel as though the number one athlete in the sport was fighting on that event. And though it did come as a surprise to see Petr Yan lose against Aljamain Sterling, I still don't think that he's outside of that conversation. But through his shutout of the Korean zombie Chan Sung-jung, Volkanovski sealed himself as the sport's top fighter. So with that being said, here are 5 performances that proved exactly how great Alexander Volkanovski is. Chad Mendes. This, for many people, was the first major introduction they got to the future featherweight king. Chad Mendes had just secured a huge first-round knockout over Miles Jury to re-establish himself in the 145-pound mix. And coming into this bout, we had every reason to suspect that Mendes would be able to regain his footing in the title picture. But during this time, Volkanovski was quietly building his momentum, showing us during a 5-fight win streak that he was headed in the right direction. And this bout was an absolute joy to watch. Mendes proved his elite caliber in moments. But for me, watching as Volkanovski moved to slowly overwhelm his opponent was a wonderful signifier of what would eventually follow. Chad really did have some big moments, even knocking down Volkanovski at one point. But even though we know him now as a methodical operator, there was a battle readiness to the future champion in this fight that really did shine through in his tougher moments. Even as it looked like Mendes was finding his momentum, Alexander would beckon him onwards, relishing the heat of the battle that was thrust upon him. And by the time the midpoint of the second round came, just minutes after being dropped, Volkanovski was proving his mettle, applying extremely heavy pressure, throwing a barrage of strikes whenever he found his range, mixing it up to the body as well, finding his mark more often than not. And when the finish did come, it proved to be a passing of the torch, as Chad Mendes then retired from MMA, and Volkanovski progressed into the top 5. Jose Aldo. This victory is one that has aged like fine wine. Watching it in real time, what we assumed we saw was an aging Jose Aldo being shut down by a fighter who was hungrier, more modern, one who was ready to feed on an old veteran reaching the end of his days. In reality, the version of Aldo we got here was a truly excellent fighter, maybe not in his prime, but continuing in his evolution. And as our knowledge and exposure to Volk's incredibly unique feinting game has improved, we can now go back to this fight and have a more clear-cut understanding of just how damn impressive it was. This Jose Aldo would go on to prove his longevity with a stunning run down at bantamweight, but we didn't know just how close to his prime he was here, and knowing that really does make this win stand out. I mean, it's hard to know exactly where his prime is, and where the difference between his athletic prime and his physical prime, his mental prime, because he is still a top contender in perhaps the best division in the sport. But anyways, in the fight with Volk, Aldo just never really got going, and in many ways he had his systems overloaded by his opponent's constant twitching feints, as well as his pressure, and that really was the story of this fight. Volkanovski turned in a tactical performance against one of the most tactically astute athletes we've ever had. After a slow round 1, Volk moved in to apply his trademark pressure, pretty much coasting past an Aldo who had just scored back-to-back finishes over Renato Moicano and Jeremy Stephens. All in all, I would say that this was a pretty comfortable victory, and one that set him up for his first shot at UFC gold. Sure, it wasn't the barn burner that the Mendes fight was, but to win like that against Jose Aldo deserves to be celebrated as a majorly impressive showing. Max Holloway won. If you needed proof of Volkanovski and his team's incredible attention to detail in their game planning, look no further than the 2 matchups between Volkanovski and the featherweight champion of the world, Max Holloway. They were 2 different bouts, of course, and the second one was a lot closer than the first in many ways. But what's interesting here is the surprise factor of watching Alexander against these divisional greats. This for me was the very last time that I was left surprised by a Volkanovski performance, one that came against an already established force of nature within the division. I remember watching it live and not fully understanding at the time just how complex a fighting system he was bringing to the table, and also how watertight it needed to be to handle the ever-growing immense technical skills of the champion Holloway. That fight saw Volkanovski outfeint him, outland him, at least in 3 of the rounds, and it was a combination of those feints and his leg kicks that really caused some noticeable doubt to creep in on Holloway's end. Again, Volkanovski's ability to grab the fight by the scruff of its neck and fight it at the pace that he desires, forcing his opponent to do the same, yeah, that's a pretty extraordinary talent, one that has been consistent throughout his career. In that first fight, Max didn't really have the answer. Indeed, it was competitive, and I do think that Holloway took the 2 final rounds. But when all was said and done, Volkanovski, through his patience and his ability to adhere to an expert game plan, as well as his ability to think and adapt on the job, yeah, these were the factors that brought him his first taste of UFC gold. And the surprise factor, our constant underrating of Volkanovski, it pretty much disappeared after this. We knew just how good Max was and still is, and I think the pieces were starting to fit together in our minds, especially after first watching Jose Aldo left without an answer, before then seeing the same thing happen to Max. Alexander Volkanovski was indeed starting to get his dues, and we were starting to accept him as the cerebral, methodical master that he is seen as today. But as far as his pairing with Holloway is concerned, that matchup would not reach its potential until their second bout, and it was truly something to behold. On a quick side note, if you're enjoying this content and would like to stay up to date with all of our weekly uploads, be sure to subscribe to the channel now and watch as we balloon up to about 218 pounds between camps before shredding ourselves back down to fighting shape, Paddy Pimblett style, when the time comes to release a video. We also have a Patreon account, so if you want to help in supporting the channel, you can find a link in the description. Max Holloway 2. Now this was a big one. The second meeting between Alexander Volkanovski and Max Holloway was not as clear-cut a fight as the first one, not even close. In this fight, we managed to get 2 of the greatest fighters of the era, throwing down in what, in my opinion, is easily among the 4 or 5 highest level fights of all time in this sport. And immediately, in the earliest exchanges, it was clear that Max Holloway was fully tuned in to the task in front of him. I don't want to say that in a way that implies that he underestimated Volkanovski in the first fight, because I don't know that. But this time, I feel like there was a different energy. Like Max had been hurt by losing his title, there was an attitude to him and an acceptance of the fact that he was in there with another great of his era. And when I watched as Holloway dropped Volkanovski once in round 1 and then again in round 2, the wheels started turning in my mind. The narrative started forming. After losing to a new rising contender, he turns it all around and comes out guns blazing in the rematch, regaining his title in a redemptive performance. And then Alexander Volkanovski showed up in a big way, adjusting to Holloway's style once again on the job, slowly growing into the fight, proving his championship caliber, winning the final 3 rounds to defend his title. And I know some people disagreed with the scoring, and it was a razor close fight, but on my second viewing, and in every subsequent rewatch I did, my scores always went for Volkanovski. It's a personal favorite fight of mine, one of those fights that you're always praying for when 5 rounds of action are scheduled. 2 technical wizards going at it in an evenly matched tactical tour de force. But the general public, to at least some extent, somehow still had their doubts about Volkanovski, seeing his successful title defense as more of an injustice to Max, rather than a triumph for him. Thankfully, the work that he would do on the next line of contenders would turn it all around. Brian Ortega. He may have dropped major losses to both Volkanovski and Holloway, but Brian Ortega is a legitimately excellent fighter. He's not perfect, not by any means, but as far as finishers are concerned, out-and-out finishers, this guy has a set of X-factors that are barely rivaled in this sport. Immense physicality for the weight class, big knockout power, incredible endurance, and some of the snappiest submissions you'll ever see in an MMA cage. He is certainly a unique threat, and boy did Alexander have to prove his mettle to get out of that cage alive. If you put round 3 to one side, this was a pretty dominant effort from Volkanovski, a perfect showcase for his skills that allowed him to really define his in-cage personality to the public, outside of his role as a heel to Holloway's hero. But I do think that he really grabbed the respect of the masses in that 3rd round, where the supremely talented submission specialist Ortega nearly caught him twice. First with a mounted guillotine, and second with his signature triangle choke. Look, I'm no expert on the relationship between fighters and fans, and how that dynamic can be influenced, but if you want to get people on your side, escaping tight submissions and then immediately posturing up, and punishing your adversary for even trying, that tends to make the crowd go absolutely bananas. And in this case, knowing what we know about T-City, seeing Volkanovski fighting out of those submissions, and then immediately putting a beating on him, that was just totally badass. But how do you see the trilogy fight between Alexander Volkanovski and Max Holloway playing out? Do let us know your opinions in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our weekly uploads. Thanks for watching.